Alright YouTube, so we are back of course to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. So we've obviously discussed a lot on this channel the possibility of Remake Part 2 ending in Nibelheim. Now that's something I'm a huge advocate for. Recently I had somebody comment on one of my videos where we've kind of touched on this. I don't know if it's a newer, older video, I don't even remember to be honest. But they were kind of disagreeing with that, which is perfectly fine. You know, that's the beauty of Part 2 is the not knowing. We have zero idea, right? How far into the world and story it's going to go for the FF7. And a lot of that's going to come down to what they're doing with the rest of the world in terms of like fleshing out locations compared to what they did with Part 1. Because Part 1 they turned Midgar, which is technically one city, but there's a lot of obviously sectors and other things like that, sectors and slums and shit. They turned one location into a full game. So how big are other locations going to be? How many chapters are each location going to have? Is it one per location, 2 or 3 per certain locations? Something else that was in Part 1 that we don't know if it's going to be in Part 2 is backtracking. Like the original FF7, the Midgar segment, you do have a bit of backtracking. You go back to Aerith's house, you go back to a wall market to come up to the Shinra building, but if I'm not mistaken, that's kind of it in terms of the backtracking. Remake Part 1 had, quite a bit. We go back to like a lot of locations. I'm not sure if that would be a thing when it comes to Part 2, at least in the locations that would be a part of that game. Now, we obviously, later on in the FF7 story, we come back to Midgar, we come back to a couple locations. But at least going forward, at least with Part 2, we shouldn't have that, but that could be a thing. Maybe we go forward a ways and we gotta come back to Calm for some reason, or whatever, who knows what they're doing. Anyways, the point of this video is that I want to talk about why I think that Nibelheim is a good end for Remake Part 2. The first and most obvious thing here is that we know, or at least are pretty sure, like 99% sure, that the game's going to open up with the Calm flashback. Now, this was already a fan theory, so to speak, long before we ever even got episode intermission. As far back as, like, I think 2019, whenever we first learned, before even E3, I think it was, or maybe at E3, that the game was going to be Midgar only. As soon as people heard that, there was a lot of people out there that were saying, well, that probably means that Part 2 is going to open up with the Calm flashback. And then fast forward, of course, to 2021 with the episode intermission. At the end of it, we get this, pretty long cutscene, and we see our characters walking to Calm. But towards the end of the cutscene, before we get to Zack stuff, we see that our characters are dropped off right outside of Calm. So there's a very good chance that when it comes to Part 2, we're either going to open up with maybe a very, very brief walk to Calm. Maybe it's going to open up with our characters already in Calm. Or maybe the game opens up in media res, which is a term that means in the midst of things. So in this case, maybe Part 2 opens up with us already in the middle of the Calm flashback. So in this case, it would be like, Cloud and Sephiroth in the back of the truck on their way to Nibelheim. Which I honestly think would be a very, very cool opening, especially for people that aren't familiar with the whole FF7 story. There's a lot of people that have only played Remake. That's it. That's all they know for FF7. So when they hop into Part 2, they're going to think it's going to pick up with, our group walking to Calm or being at Calm or whatever the case. But if it opens up with this right here, they're going to be wondering, what the fuck? The reason why I bring up the potential opening for Part 2 is I think narratively it makes the most sense. If they're going to open the game up with the destruction and massacre of Nibelheim, it kind of only makes sense that the game also end there. Because it's this massive revelation whenever you get there. The game opened up with Cloud explaining to everybody his history with Sephiroth, why he's wanting to hunt down and kill Sephiroth. Sephiroth massacred his village. Even Tifa remembers this shit. So once they later arrive at Nibelheim and see that it's perfectly fine, even has its own population of people, and some cloaked guys, some cloaked figures, some reunion dudes, it's this big what the fuck moment. Because either Cloud's misremembering stuff, which is, that's kind of the case here, or he's lying. And in a roundabout way, also Tifa's lying, because she kind of corroborates some of the stuff that he says. And this is honestly a relatively common trope, especially in stuff like movies, where like a movie might open up with a tragedy for the hero. Like maybe his family gets killed, and then by the end of the movie, he gets to kill the bad guy that killed his family. So in this case, Remake Part 2 opens up with the Nibelheim incident flashback, the Calm flashback, whatever you want to call it. And then later on, the game's going to end at Nibelheim itself, where we probably confront Sephiroth and we get some sort of confrontation between him and Cloud. Potentially we get another boss fight or something, though it'd be kind of diminishing returns to fight Sephiroth again at the end of the next game. But possibility. One of the common arguments against Part 2 ending at Nibelheim is using the original game as the reference or the example is that this isn't really an important location, at least later on. With the Nibelheim incident, it's obviously a big deal. But when we come here in the story, you can literally just pass through. You don't have to go into the Shinra Manor, which is really the only place you can get a bit of narrative and story from. You can walk right through Nibelheim and go to Mount Nibel. You don't have to do anything here. So it's kind of a somewhat nothing location. You do obviously get Vincent here and you can run into Sephiroth, but again, that's all optional. And while I do think there's something somewhat there to that discussion, or that argument, it won't really be the case when it comes to Remake, right? When we get to Nibelheim, there's going to be a story. We're not just going to walk through the location of Nibelheim in Part 2. They're going to make us go into the Shinra Manor for whatever reason, whatever objective, and we're going to be forced to run into Vincent and probably also Sephiroth in the basement, just like the original game. Now, whether or not there's this like optional shit to do in the Shinra Manor where you can track down like the codes to the safe and find a lost number and get some treasure, I don't know that they'd make that entirely optional. Maybe. There was some side questing stuff in Remake Part 1, but there wasn't like a whole lot of like secretive shit, if any at all. And while I do truly believe that Part 2 is going to end at Nibelheim, I'm not entirely sure what the payoff's going to be there. Again, the original game didn't really have that much there, other than a run-in with Sephiroth. And the only thing I can really come up with is maybe the group, specifically Cloud, though, find out the truth sooner. Because I've already kind of teased that shit with Remake Part 1. With Part 1, we already had Aerith say the name Zack to Cloud in the Sector 6 park, but of course he had his little headache and blinked it out, didn't hear it. We also had Hojo attempting to tell Cloud within the Shinra building that he's actually not a soldier. And also with that ending cutscene on the highway, we get that scene with Zack, but the way they show it, it seems like it's being shown to our group. Because it goes into Cloud, it does the fuzzy screen, shit, headache, all that stuff. And whenever the Zack scene ends, we're back, but we're on Aerith this time. So I've always interpreted that scene as it's being shown to our group, or maybe just being shown to Cloud and Aerith. Because it's very similar to whenever we later on destroy parts of the Whisper Harbinger, we get the same fuzzy screen shit, the lights, and we're shown a vision of some sort. So for me with Remake Part 1, they've already, at several points, laid the groundwork for Cloud finding out the truth a lot sooner than he did with the original FF7. So I think it makes sense that once we get to Nibelheim, the payoff there is Cloud finding out the truth. Maybe Sephiroth tells him, maybe Tifa tells him, or maybe we run into Zack there. Because if Zack's like lost in this world, bring up Zack, I guess, for this too, fuck it. Maybe for whatever reason, at some point on his journey, looking for Aerith and other things, trying to figure out what's going on, he travels back to Nibelheim, and maybe that's where the truth comes out. Because my thinking with this is, with the original FF7, like, the revelation of Cloud having Zack's memories and not remembering things accurately and all that other shit was a massive, major twist. Like, it was super unexpected. It was fantastic back in the day. These days, it's pretty much in the zeitgeist. Most people know the FF7 story. And even if you don't, by the time, if they're trying to string this along for 3 or 4 games, try to keep it a secret that Cloud doesn't have the right memories, like, people that are waiting on the next, remake game might opt to play the original FF7. And by then, it's not a surprise anymore. Cloud's faulty memories are pretty much like this open secret, because the majority of the people that played Remake have played the original FF7, so they already know this, and a lot of people that played Remake for the first time, as their first step into FF7, have gone back and played the original game. So it's like this thing that they almost just have to get out of the way eventually. And because we know the Remake project is for new and old players, that's why I think they're going to do something different. Like, I do want to see the Medill segment. I would love to see that. I'd love to see Cloud and Tifa fall into this live stream and get some sort of abstract location where we're piecing together Cloud's memories. Like, that should be pretty cool to see, but I think they're going to do something different. Especially with what they've been kind of laying the groundwork for with Part 1. One of the other reasons why I think that Nibelheim is the perfect ending for Remake Part 2 is the amount of locations on the world map, because from Calm to Nibelheim is about like 15 locations, kind of give or take a few, depending on which locations you think would be their own dedicated locations / chapters. So that alone can tell us damn near 15 chapters of the game, and whether or not they have more or less chapters in the first remake, that we can't really say. But that gives them the freedom to make pretty much every location from Calm to Nibelheim its own dedicated story / chapter, with the freedom to do brand new stuff, whether they want to add new locations or new stories, or you have certain locations that can have more than one chapter, something like Gold Saucer. Like, once we get to Gold Saucer, doing all this stuff up there with, Kate Sith and all the other shit, that's its own chapter. But once we get thrown into prison and go down to the desert prison, Krell prison, and do the dying stuff, like, that's probably going to be its own chapter as well. So then technically, Gold Saucer had 2+ chapters in one location. And we also got to factor in the Zack stuff, whatever's going on with him. There's got to be cutaways at certain points, I'd imagine, with Part 2. At least, even if there's just a few of them throughout the game, there's got to be cutaways, maybe even controllable segments with Zack. Like, it's really hard to say what they're going to do. I just feel like there's too much content between Calm and Nibelheim for them to go beyond Nibelheim. And while I do say that I think Part 2 is going to end at Nibelheim, this does also include Mount Nibel, because that is a part of Nibelheim. The reactor is a big part of the whole story that took place in Nibelheim, so maybe we go up to the top of the mountain to the reactor, maybe that's where the game ends at potentially. But also, I'm giving a little bit of, I'm kind of cheating here. I'm also leaving an open chapter after Nibelheim potentially. And why I say that is because Part 1 ended at the end of the highway, just like the Midgar segment ended in the original game, but we got an entire other chapter inside the Singularity and shit, right? I don't know if they're going to do that same sort of thing at the end of Part 2, because the Whisper should be destroyed, but that doesn't mean there couldn't be some crazy-ass extra chapter shit. But of course, if the game is ending at Nibelheim, this would mean that we shouldn't get Vincent as a controllable character, maybe like an AI control character that helps us in fights similar to Red 13 at the end of Part 1. It would also mean that we're not going to get Cid, since Rocket Town is after Nibelheim. But as much as that does suck, and it does suck a lot to not have those characters, it gives you something to look forward to with the next game. And I think ultimately, before we get to the conclusion of this video, my other part of thinking with this is that the further we go into the story and the world and everything like that, the more everything else as a whole is going to suffer, right? If we go all the way to the North Crater, if we go all the way to the Forgotten Capital, like, everything before it's going to have to be sacrificed to some degree. Like, where there might have been a lot more story maybe in Junon, like, they can't do that because we got to go to the next location. We got to try to cram all this into one game. Square Enix isn't the best at open world games. Like, we kind of all know that. So, the more we go into the world and into the story, it's just, I think everything else all around is going to suffer more. But my dudes, of course, those are my thoughts on the topic. We've talked a lot about Nibelheim being the ending of Part 2. I've had a lot of people agree with me, but obviously there's people out there that disagree. But I want to do a dedicated video about the topic, kind of get all my thoughts out there for why I think the way that I do and why I'm pretty adamant about this. I could be wrong, of course. We might get blown away. Maybe Part 2 is going to be on the PS5, right? So maybe they can squeeze a shit ton into the game. Maybe we go all the way to the North Crater like a lot of people think we will. I'd be surprised if that happens, but maybe. So, of course, passing off to you guys, it's a topic we've talked about quite a bit, but where do you think Part 2 is going to go? How far into the story do you think we're going to go? How, location-wise, story-wise, whatever the case. What do you think we're going to do? That's the video, my dudes. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, go to thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you guys aren't new. Once I did more Final Fantasy VII Remake content, turn on notifications, follow me on Twitter, dashingdavidYT, and my Discord. Links to my social networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.